It was just another scorching day at Black Ridge Outpost, a remote and forgotten border station where soldiers stood guard against the relentless desert sun. Their boots pressed into the dry, cracked earth, their uniforms stained with dust and sweat. For months, they had worked tirelessly, day and night, without recognition, without applause. No news cameras, no headlines. Just duty, exhaustion, and the quiet, unspoken question in their minds, does anyone even care? Then, out of nowhere, the sound of a helicopter sliced through the heavy silence. Soldiers instinctively turned their heads, squinting against the blinding sun as a gust of wind kicked up a storm of dust and sand. There were no banners, no grand motorcade, no flood of reporters. Just one man stepping off the aircraft with a purposeful stride, Donald Trump. There had been no press release, no carefully curated speech prepared for the cameras. Just the former president, arriving unannounced, walking straight into the heart of a place that most politicians only saw on briefing papers. The soldiers didn't rush to greet him. They had seen officials come and go, making promises that faded as soon as they left. But Trump's first words weren't a campaign slogan or a rehearsed monologue. "Can someone tell me how your day has been?" The question hung in the air, simple yet unexpected. It wasn't political, it was human. For the first time in a long time, these men and women, hardened by their experiences, felt like someone wasn't here to talk at them, but to listen. And in that moment, everything began to change. Back in Washington, far from the scorching heat of the border, inside the high-security walls of the White House Situation Room, tension hung in the air. The glow of massive digital screens cast eerie reflections on the faces of top military officials, national security advisors, and Pentagon representatives. Stacks of classified reports cluttered the long mahogany table, filled with numbers, statistics, and bureaucratic jargon, cold, lifeless data that told only part of the story. At the head of the table sat Donald Trump, scanning the pages with a sharp, analytical gaze. He had never been one for endless reports, he preferred action over paperwork, but today, something had caught his attention. The room was eerily silent, save for the sound of flipping pages and the occasional cough. Then, the Secretary of Defense, John Matthews, a seasoned leader with silver-streaked hair and the weight of decades of military service in his eyes, broke the silence. "Mr. President, this is our latest intelligence on border security," Matthews said, clearing his throat. "We've deployed additional military forces to assist Border Patrol, but..." He hesitated, exchanging uneasy glances with the other officials in the room. Trump's eyes narrowed. "But what?" The answer came from General Robert Keller, the no-nonsense commander of the Border Task Force. His voice was steady, but beneath it lay a frustration that had been building for months. "Sir, illegal crossings remain a challenge, but the real issue isn't just logistics, it's morale. Our men have been stationed at the border for months, enduring brutal conditions, and they feel abandoned. They lack proper resources, proper support. And worst of all, they don't know if anyone in Washington actually cares." The words landed heavily in the room. No one spoke. No one dared to. But the look in Trump's eyes said everything. His jaw tightened, his fingers clenched into a fist on the table. He hated bureaucratic excuses, hated the endless cycle of meetings that led to nowhere. "The media isn't talking about this," Trump said, his voice low but firm. "All I see are articles about policy debates, budgets, and politics. But where are the stories about our soldiers out there, struggling every single day?" Matthews nodded grimly. "Sir, we've proposed improvements, but government processes move slowly. It could take months, years, before real change happens." That was all Trump needed to hear. Without a word, he shoved the report aside, the thick stack of classified documents landing with a heavy thud on the table. Then, with a sharp resolve in his eyes, he stood up. "I don't have time for another report. I want to see for myself what's happening." The room fell deathly silent. Keller shifted in his seat. "Sir, are you saying you want to go to the border?" Personally, Trump didn't hesitate. Exactly. Get the plane ready. I want to meet our soldiers today. A murmur rippled through the room. A presidential border visit required weeks of planning, advanced security protocols, and media coordination. But Trump wasn't interested in formalities. He wasn't interested in carefully staged events. Matthews furrowed his brow. Sir, with all due respect, this isn't a safe trip. The border is unpredictable, and without proper planning. Trump cut him off with a firm hand. John, I'm not asking for a press conference. I'm asking for the truth. If I can't stand among my soldiers, listen to them, see what they go through, then I have no business sitting in this chair. The weight of those words settled over the room like a storm rolling in. Every official present knew one thing: when Trump made up his mind, nothing could stop him. Matthews exhaled sharply, resigned to what was happening. Understood, Mr. President. We'll make the arrangements immediately. Trump nodded. Good. We leave in an hour. With that, he turned and strode out of the room, leaving behind a stunned group of officials. No one had expected this. No one had anticipated that the President of the United States would bypass all the red tape and head straight to the front lines himself. But they all knew one thing for certain: this was about to change everything. The helicopter thundered through the vast Texas sky, slicing through the dry, sweltering air. Below, the landscape stretched endlessly: barren desert, rugged mountains, and winding dirt roads leading to the heart of America's southern border. It was a land of extremes, where the sun scorched the earth by day, and the cold crept in mercilessly by night. But down there, among the dust and the silence, soldiers stood watch, day in and day out, unseen, uncelebrated, and all too often, forgotten. Inside the helicopter, the air was tense. No one spoke. The usual political advisors were absent. This was not a press event, not a carefully curated spectacle. It was a mission of truth. Donald Trump sat by the window, arms crossed, his gaze locked on the terrain below. He had seen maps, briefing papers, and intelligence reports, but none of it compared to this. Numbers on a page couldn't capture the relentless isolation, the suffocating heat, the exhaustion etched into the very earth itself. Across from him sat John Matthews, the Secretary of Defense, a man who had spent years navigating the corridors of Washington and the battlefields of the world. He studied Trump carefully. He had seen many presidents, many leaders, but this was different. Sir, Matthews finally spoke, breaking the thick silence. The outpost we're heading to isn't a standard military base. It's remote. Barely equipped. Conditions are harsh. There's no airstrip, no real facilities. Just a handful of soldiers holding the line against whatever comes their way. Trump didn't look away from the window. Then it sounds like exactly the place I need to see. Matthews exhaled, exchanging a glance with General Robert Keller, the battle-hardened commander of the Border Task Force. Keller, a man who had seen his share of war zones, nodded slowly. He understood what Trump was saying. He had served in conflicts across the world, but this battle, this quiet, relentless war at the border, was different. There were no explosions, no headlines, just the daily grind of exhaustion, isolation, and duty. We'll be landing in 15 minutes, Keller said, glancing at his watch. Security has been set, but this area isn't exactly safe. Smuggling cartels operate nearby. They don't hesitate to engage patrol forces. Trump's expression didn't change. I'm not here to be protected, he said, his voice steady. I'm here to see the truth. Keller and Matthews fell silent. They had worked with presidents before, politicians who gave speeches from behind bulletproof glass, who made promises from the safety of their offices. But this was different. No cameras, no script, no carefully staged photo ops, just a man who had come to stand among the soldiers who had long felt abandoned. As the helicopter began its descent, the landscape sharpened into focus. Black Ridge Outpost came into view, a small, isolated cluster of makeshift buildings, barbed wire fences, and watchtowers hastily constructed against the harsh desert backdrop. This wasn't a high-tech military installation. This was the front line, raw and unfiltered. The rotor blades kicked up a thick cloud of dust as the chopper touched down, the whirling sand sticking to the worn uniforms of the waiting soldiers. But they didn't move. There were no lined-up salutes, no choreographed greetings. Just cautious, skeptical eyes watching as Donald Trump stepped out onto the cracked, sun-beaten ground. Standing at the forefront was Captain Mark Reynolds, the outpost commander. A man built from years of service, his face weathered, his posture rigid with discipline. His piercing gaze carried not admiration, but doubt. Was this just another visit? Another politician who would shake hands, nod sympathetically, and then disappear? "Sir," Reynolds said, his voice steady, "welcome to Black Ridge Outpost." Trump nodded but didn't waste time on pleasantries. He met Reynolds' stare head-on, unwavering. "Thank you, Captain. But I didn't come here to be welcomed. I came to hear the truth." Reynolds studied him for a long moment, then glanced back at his fellow soldiers. There was no point in sugarcoating reality. He straightened his shoulders. "Then I hope you're ready, sir. Because what we're about to tell you isn't in any report." Trump's jaw tightened. "Good," he said, "because I don't care about what's on paper. I want to know what's real." The soldiers exchanged uncertain glances, some still skeptical, others intrigued. They had heard plenty of speeches before. But for the first time, they weren't looking at a leader who had come to talk, they were looking at one who had come to listen. And in that moment, everything began to change. Inside the small, dimly lit mess hall, a silence hung heavy in the air. Soldiers sat at worn-down steel tables, their trays half-empty, their faces unreadable. They weren't used to visitors, especially not presidents. And certainly not one who had just walked in, pulled up a chair, and asked them to tell the truth. Donald Trump sat at the center of the room, his hands resting on the table, his gaze scanning the faces before him. He wasn't here for a speech, wasn't here for a photo op. He was here to listen. "All right," he said, his voice steady but firm. "Tell me what's really happening here." At first, no one spoke. Their eyes darted toward one another, some hesitant, others skeptical. Politicians had visited before, each with their carefully rehearsed words, their polite nods, their empty promises. But this felt different. Then, finally, a young soldier set his fork down and looked up. His face was sunburned, his short black hair damp with sweat. He swallowed hard before speaking. "My name is Jake Miller, sir," he said. His voice was dry, as if the words had been bottled up too long. "I've been stationed here for 18 months. And I don't know if I can keep doing this." The room tensed. Jake clenched his fists as if wrestling with the decision to keep talking. Then, his voice steadied. "When I first came here, I felt proud. I wanted to serve my country, to make a difference. But as the months dragged on, I started feeling like I was nothing more than a ghost. We go out on patrols day and night, facing dangers no one talks about. We've been in firefights with smugglers. I've watched my friends collapse from exhaustion after 18-hour shifts, only to get back up and keep going because there's no one else to take their place." His voice grew quieter, but the weight of his words filled the room. "But the worst part, sir. When we look toward Washington, we don't know if anyone actually cares." Trump didn't respond right away. He simply held Jake's gaze, letting the words settle. Then, another voice broke the silence. "I'm Sergeant Emily Carter." A woman with chestnut-brown hair tucked beneath her cap sat across from Trump. Her posture was rigid, but there was something heavy behind her eyes. "I've been here for 3 years. That means I've missed my daughter's birthday 3 times." She exhaled softly, forcing herself to continue. "Every time I call home, she asks me, "Mom, are you coming back this time?" And every time, I have to tell her, "No, sweetheart. Mommy is still on duty." A small, almost bitter laugh escaped her lips, but her eyes betrayed her pain. How do you explain to a 6-year-old that her mother can't come home, because her job is to protect a wall? The room grew still. Then, a deeper voice, one hardened by years of service. "I'm Captain Thomas Walker," said an older soldier, his sun-weathered face etched with lines of experience. "I've served for over 25 years. And I used to believe that when my service was over, there'd be something waiting for me. A home. A future." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "But then I watched too many of my brothers return home to nothing. No job. No family. No support. One of my closest friends, someone I went to war with, someone who saved my life, died in a homeless shelter." Walker swallowed hard, his jaw tightening. He was a great soldier. A hero. But in the end, he was just a statistic in a government report about homeless veterans. The weight of his words pressed down on the room, suffocating in its truth. Some soldiers lowered their gazes, staring at their hands. Because Walker's story wasn't just his. It was theirs. Trump clenched his fists, then slowly rose to his feet. "No one should have to live like this," he said, his voice low but firm. "No one should be forgotten." His eyes swept across the room, meeting each soldier's gaze. "I can't change what's already happened. I can't give you back the years you've lost. But I can promise you this, starting today, I will do everything in my power to make sure that none of you ever feel abandoned again." No one clapped. No one cheered. But something shifted. A flicker of hope, fragile, but real, lit up in the eyes of soldiers who had long since stopped believing. Jake, the young soldier, locked eyes with Trump for the first time, as if daring to believe. "Sir, are you really going to do that?" Trump nodded without hesitation. "I will. And if I don't, call me. Remind me of this promise." The room was silent for a few seconds. Then, Captain Walker let out a low chuckle, warm but laced with disbelief. "Sir, are you sure you want to open yourself up to hundreds of calls from us?" Trump smirked. "If that's what it takes to make sure you get what you deserve, then I'm ready." For the first time in months, real smiles appeared on the faces of these border soldiers. Not because they blindly believed that everything would change overnight. But because, for the first time, they felt seen. The air inside the mess hall was thick with an unspoken energy. No one had expected this. Not the soldiers, not their commanders, not even Trump's own advisors. A president had just sat among them, not to deliver another empty speech, not to shake hands and pose for the cameras, but to listen. To truly hear them. And now, he was standing, his fists clenched, his jaw tight with resolve. Trump turned to Captain Mark Reynolds, the Outpost commander. "Can you take me around the base?" Reynolds blinked, caught off guard. "You mean, right now, sir?" Trump nodded. "I don't just want to listen. I want to see." The room fell into stunned silence. This wasn't how these visits went. Presidents didn't just wander through the trenches of America's forgotten warriors. They stayed behind security barriers, visited sanitized briefing rooms, and left with a stack of reports. But Reynolds wasn't about to say no. He gave a sharp nod. "Yes, sir." Trump strode out of the mess hall, his boots crunching against the dry, cracked earth. The soldiers outside turned their heads, watching as the most powerful man in the country walked straight into their reality. He saw it all. Rows of metal bunks, neatly arranged but worn from years of use. Soldiers' uniforms, hung up under the blistering sun, still stained with sweat and desert dust. The water barrels, nearly empty, struggling to last through another relentless summer. At a small repair station, soldiers worked in silence, their hands covered in grease as they patched up a decade-old armored vehicle that should have been replaced years ago. Reynolds gestured toward it, his voice edged with frustration. "This is what we have to work with, sir. These vehicles are over 10 years old. Half of them barely run anymore. We've sent requests for replacements, but there's no funding. So we fix what we can, with whatever scraps we have left." Trump ran his hand along the dented metal, his expression unreadable. But something in his eyes said enough. "How long has it been since you last got new equipment?" Reynolds exhaled deeply. "Almost 2 years, sir. We keep asking, but bureaucracy moves too slowly. And while we wait, we make do." Trump clenched his jaw. He had read about government red tape before. He had seen the excuses, the delays, the endless cycle of, "we're working on it." But standing here, seeing it firsthand, watching the cost of Washington's inaction play out in real time, was different. They kept walking. Then, something made Trump stop. In the far corner of the outpost, a small group of soldiers sat around a makeshift wooden table, letters scattered across its surface. Some crisp and new, others creased and worn from being read over and over again. Reynolds followed Trump's gaze and spoke softly. "They're reading mail from home." Trump approached. One young soldier, no older than 25, held a letter in his hands, his eyes distant, lost in the words written inside. Trump lowered his voice. "Who's it from?" The soldier stiffened, startled. Slowly, he looked up. "It's from my mother, sir." His throat tightened, as if the words were hard to say. "She says she misses me. But she's not sure if I miss her, because I haven't been home in 2 years." Silence. Trump met the soldier's gaze, his expression unwavering. "Do you miss her?" The young man's grip tightened around the letter. His voice was unsteady. "Every single day, sir." Reynolds cleared his throat, stepping forward. His voice was steady, but there was something deeper beneath it, something raw. "Sir, this is the real issue. We love this country. But sometimes, it feels like we have to choose between being a soldier and being a son. A father. A mother. We shouldn't have to choose." Trump stood still for a long moment. Then, he exhaled sharply. It was the sound of something snapping into place. "Enough." He turned to Reynolds. "I can't stand here, listen to these stories, and do nothing." Reynolds let out a small, cynical laugh, shaking his head. "Sir, I've heard a lot of politicians say that before." Trump locked eyes with him. "You won't have to hear me say it. You'll see me do it." Then, he turned to John Matthews, who had been silent until now. "I want a full report on this base's conditions, tomorrow. And don't give me a breakdown of the budget. I want to know exactly what we can fix right now." For the first time that day, Matthews looked surprised, and maybe, just maybe, a little impressed. "Yes, sir." Trump continued, pointing toward the soldiers still clutching their letters. "I also want an emergency plan to support soldiers like him. We're creating a rotation system so they can spend time with their families without compromising their mission." Reynolds folded his arms, studying Trump carefully. "And what about the ones who've already served, sir? The ones like Captain Walker, veterans with nowhere to go?" Trump didn't blink. "We're going to change that." He turned to General Keller. "I want a full list of struggling veterans. I want to know where they are, what they need. We're launching a program for jobs, housing, and healthcare. And we're doing it now." The room fell into absolute silence. This wasn't a campaign promise. This was an order. Jake Miller, the young soldier, stared at Trump, caught between disbelief and hope. "Sir, you're really going to do this?" Trump nodded, his voice unwavering. "I don't promise things I can't deliver. Black Ridge had never seen a moment like this. A president had come, not to talk, but to listen. To see. And most importantly, to act. No one clapped. No one cheered. But something had shifted. A fragile hope had begun to flicker in the hearts of men who had long since stopped believing. Trump turned to Matthews and Keller. "Are we done here?" For the first time, Reynolds let himself smile. "Sir, I think we're only just getting started." 3 weeks after Donald Trump's unexpected visit to Black Ridge Outpost, something incredible happened. It started with a single delivery, then another. And another. First, a convoy of new patrol vehicles arrived, engines roaring, replacing the decade-old, barely functioning trucks that had once forced soldiers to risk their lives with unreliable equipment. Then came shipments of protective gear, food supplies, and upgraded communication systems, things that had been caught in bureaucratic limbo for months, even years. But now, they were here. And they weren't just promises on paper anymore. For the first time in years, the men and women stationed at Black Ridge felt something new, they mattered. But the most significant change wasn't the equipment. It was something even bigger, something no one had dared to believe would actually happen. A new rotation system was implemented, allowing frontline soldiers to finally go home on leave, to hug their children, to sit at their own dinner tables, to remind their families that they were more than just distant voices on a phone call. Sergeant Emily Carter, the mother who had missed her daughter's birthday 3 years in a row, was standing outside the outpost when her phone rang. She answered, and on the other end came the tiny, excited voice of her 6-year-old daughter. "Mommy. Are you really coming home?" Emily gripped the phone tighter, her throat tightening. For the first time in 3 years, she could say something other than no. "Yes, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm on my way home." Across the camp, Jake Miller, the young soldier who had spoken up that day in the mess hall, was packing his gear, not to leave for good, but because, for the first time, he had been granted leave. Something that had once seemed impossible. As he stepped out of his tent, he found Captain Mark Reynolds waiting for him. The hardened commander crossed his arms, a rare smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You know, Miller," Reynolds said, "I've never seen a promise kept this fast." Jake let out a small laugh, shaking his head. "Neither have I, sir." But it wasn't just the soldiers still on duty who felt the impact of this change. Far away, amidst the bustling streets of New York City, Captain Thomas Walker, the man who had once believed he would be forgotten like so many other veterans, stood on a street corner, staring at an envelope in his hands. Inside, written in official government letterhead, were the words that made his hands tremble. He had been approved for veteran housing. After more than 25 years of service. After watching too many of his brothers in arms return to nothing. After years of struggling to stay afloat in a system that had failed him, he finally had a place to call home. That night, Walker sat on a park bench, fingers running over the letter as if trying to convince himself it was real. He had lost too many friends. He had seen too many like him abandoned by the system. But now, for the first time in years, he knew something had changed. Meanwhile, back in Washington, Donald Trump sat in the Oval Office, reviewing a new set of reports, not the typical political briefings, not abstract budget numbers, but real, tangible results. A list of veterans who had received housing assistance. A breakdown of border soldiers now benefiting from the new leave program. A summary of what had already been done, and what still needed to be fixed. The phone rang. John Matthews, the Secretary of Defense, was on the other end. "Mr. President," Matthews said, "I just got word from Black Ridge. Your reforms are making a real impact. Reynolds says that for the first time in years, the soldiers there feel like they haven't been forgotten." Trump nodded slowly, his voice steady. "Good. But we're not stopping here. If there's even the slightest delay in these policies being carried out, I want to know immediately." Matthews chuckled, shaking his head. "Mr. President, I think you've just set a new standard for us." Trump smirked but didn't take his eyes off the reports in front of him. "Good," he said. "Make sure we keep it that way." A few days later, at Black Ridge Outpost, a new sign was placed at the entrance. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't political. It was a promise, 3 simple words etched in bold letters. No one left behind. And this time, everyone at Black Ridge knew, it wasn't just a slogan. It was real. The stories from Black Ridge Outpost weren't just about the soldiers stationed at the border. They were about something deeper, loyalty, sacrifice, and a promise that, for once, was actually kept. For too long, these men and women had stood watch in silence, patrolling under the scorching sun, enduring the bitter cold of the desert nights. They had watched politicians come and go, heard speeches about policy and funding, only to return to the same reality: outdated equipment, dwindling supplies, and the nagging feeling that their sacrifices didn't matter. But this time, something had changed. A president had come, not to talk, but to listen. Not to shake hands for a photo op, but to see. And most importantly, to act. No one at Black Ridge had expected their lives to change overnight. Yet, within weeks, the impossible had happened. They had seen new patrol vehicles arrive, replacing the rusting, decade-old trucks that had broken down one too many times. They had received new protective gear, fresh supplies, and better equipment, not just promises of them, but the real thing, delivered straight to their hands. And for the first time in years, they had something they thought they had lost forever: hope. It wasn't just the soldiers at Black Ridge who felt the change. Across the country, veterans who had once been forgotten were finally being seen. In a small veteran housing facility in Texas, an old Marine named Tom Gibson, who had spent years struggling to survive after leaving the service, opened a letter from the Department of Veterans Affairs. His hands trembled as he read the words. "You have been approved for housing assistance." For the first time in years, Tom wasn't just another statistic in a bureaucratic report. He was a man who had served his country, and now, his country was finally serving him back. In Chicago, a single father and former Army medic named Luis Hernandez received a call that brought him to his knees. He had been waiting for months, hoping for something, anything, that could help him rebuild his life. "Mr. Hernandez, we have a job placement program for veterans, and we'd like to bring you in for an interview." Luis covered his face with his hands. He had spent the last year struggling to make ends meet, bouncing from one temporary gig to another. Now, for the first time, there was a future waiting for him. These were the stories that didn't make the headlines. The victories that weren't televised. But for the men and women who had spent years believing the system had forgotten them, this was everything. And back in Washington, Donald Trump wasn't done. Every morning, a new report landed on his desk, not just numbers, but names. Real people. Real lives being changed. And every morning, he made the same demand. What's next? What more can we do? It wasn't about politics. It wasn't about approval ratings. It was about something much simpler: keeping a promise. The final change came not in the form of another policy, another funding package, or another executive order. It came in the form of 3 simple words that now stood at the entrance of Black Ridge Outpost. A sign, newly placed, bold and unshakable. No one left behind. This time, it wasn't just a slogan. It was the truth. The stories from Black Ridge Outpost weren't just about the soldiers stationed at the border. They weren't just about the veterans who had been cast aside, or the families waiting for a call that might never come. This story was about something bigger, something that America had forgotten for too long. It was about the men and women who serve in silence, who stand guard when the rest of the country sleeps, who endure not for glory or recognition, but because they believe in something greater than themselves. It was about promises that had been made, and broken, over and over again. Until now. One visit. One decision to listen instead of talk. One leader who refused to accept the usual excuses. And suddenly, something that had once felt impossible, something that had been trapped in the endless red tape of Washington, was happening. Soldiers were going home to see their families. Veterans were getting the help they had been promised. Equipment was arriving not in months, but in days. And most importantly, for the first time in years, these warriors, these forgotten heroes, felt seen. But here's the truth, this story isn't over. Right now, as you read this, soldiers are still out there, standing watch under the same scorching sun, patrolling the same endless borders. They are still missing birthdays, still sacrificing holidays, still wondering if anyone back home even knows they exist. And veterans, men and women who once wore the uniform with pride, are still struggling. Some are sleeping on streets they once fought to protect. Others are lost in a system that moves too slow, caught between the past and a future that feels just out of reach. They don't need speeches. They don't need pity. They need action. They need recognition. They need to know that their sacrifices matter. And that's where we come in. We can make sure their voices are heard. We can share their stories. We can remind those in power that this country does not forget its heroes. If you believe that the men and women who serve this country deserve better, let your voice be heard. If you believe that no soldier should feel abandoned, say something. If you believe that no veteran should be left without a home, stand up for them. This isn't just about one visit. It isn't just about one moment. This is about a promise that must never be broken again. A promise that is now written in bold letters at the entrance of Black Ridge Outpost. No one left behind. And this time, it's not just a slogan. It's a commitment. What happens next is up to us.